About a year and a half ago, I gave a presentation to the college that I work for about near-death experiences, and I had a fellow faculty member stand up at the end of the presentation and absolutely flame me. I was stunned at that kind of behavior and really didn't know what to do with it, so I called Bruce. And he talked me off the edge of the cliff and really guided me in a way to help me understand what was going on with this kind of antagonism and how to deal with that in both a professional and personal manner. So the last thing I'd like to leave you with is that Bruce has a wonderful heart, and who else would name a presentation still crazy after all these years? Bruce Greyson.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. I'm live for you now. I asked for that. Before I start my presentation, I need to say that this is one of the presentations that is approved for continuing education credits for nursing. And Debbie tells me that in order to qualify for this, I have to make a formal declaration of any significant relationships that I have, so you know that they're not biased. So I thought about it, and these are the most significant relationships I think I have. So here's my formal declaration. So someone expressed concern to me yesterday that I had subtitled this, "Still Crazy After All These Years." She said that she understood what I was talking about, but that someone else who had just happened to read the program and knew that I was a psychiatrist might think that I was saying something about end of ears. So I'd like to explain what I meant by this with the help of the Oxford English Dictionary. The OED says that crazy can mean distracted or mad with excitement, vehement desire, eager or enthusiastic, as in being crazy about a loved one. And one of the things that amazes me about IANDS, about its membership, is that after 30 years, it's still as excited, vehement, eager, and enthusiastic as it ever was. The OED also says that crazy can mean unrestrained, excited, excellent, or admirable, as in a crazy rhythm in jazz. And again, 30 years later, IANDS is still as excited and excellent as ever. And finally, crazy can mean characterized by conflicting and unresolved situations. For its entire history, IANDS has struggled with the conflicting goals of supporting experiencers, educating the public, and supporting researchers. And I'm delighted to find that as IANDS approaches middle age, it's still as crazy as ever after all these years. I was asked, as one of the founders of IANDS, to speak about the history of IANDS and near-death research. I tried to think about what I could offer that someone with fewer years in the field might not. And one answer was to look back at how IANDS got started and how IANDS and near-death research have changed over the years and how they've changed the world over the years. And there are three aspects of these changes that I'd like to discuss this morning. How IANDS has evolved, how our understanding of near-death experiencers has evolved, and how our thinking about how the mind and brain interact have evolved. So to start with, let me take you back to the beginnings of IANDS. Back in the late 1970s, after Raymond Moody published his groundbreaking book, Life After Life, which gave near-death experiences a name for the first time and brought them into the public eye, Raymond was contacted by a number of clinicians and researchers who were interested in studying this newly labeled phenomenon. Raymond wisely brought them all together, or more accurately, he asked John Odette to bring them all together. And largely through John's vision of what this could be, it grew into an organization that now became IANDS. Some of the early meetings of this group took place at Raymond's farm in Headwaters, Virginia. Now, to give you a better flavor of IANDS' origins, let me show you exactly where this farm was located. Can you see it there? It was rather prophetic that this was located in a small village called Headwaters, because from that humble beginning has flowed an international movement that we now know as IANDS. Raymond himself is not an organization person and didn't want any part of being an officer of this fledgling organization. So nurturing and structuring this new organization fell to a small group of young folks too naive to understand what they were getting into. That's, on the left is Ken Ring, and behind him is John Odette. And then Bruce Greyson and Mike Sabom. A few years after this, IANDS had moved to Connecticut, to Ken Ring's office actually, and had a slightly more diverse leadership. This is Ken Ring and then me. In the back is Chuck Flynn, and to his left is Boyce Beatty and then John Odette, and in the middle is Nancy Evans Bush, who for many years was the executive director and then later president of IANDS. Just as Raymond was the person who single-handedly brought NDEs out of the closet, and John was the person who single-handedly organized the group, and Ken Ring was the person who almost single-handedly gave it an academic route, it's impossible to overestimate the role that Nancy Bush played in directing this organization through those early troublesome years, when the board not only had to survive on a shoestring, but had to supply our own shoestrings. By the mid-1980s, IANDS had formed a substantial board of directors and support staff. And most of these people are no longer with us. Some you'll recognize. Nancy Bush is towards the left in the bottom, and I am sort of in the middle with the IANDS t-shirt. Up near the top on the left is my wife Jenny, who is still with us. And up on the top row on the far left is Kimberly Clark Sharp, the founder of the longest running IANDS group in Seattle. As I said, IANDS grew at a group of clinicians and researchers that Raymond and John had pulled together. Folks who had found NDEs intriguing and important enough to learn about them. Most of these folks were scholars who were fairly isolated in their own institutions in terms of their interest in NDEs. My hope in starting IANDS was that this group of clinicians and researchers would at least provide each other with the support and encouragement to pursue these interests, and possibly even collaborate on a multi-centered study of NDEs with collectively agreed-on research techniques and data collection instruments. What IANDS actually did become was both more and less than I had hoped for. The less part was that this diverse group of clinicians and researchers, some of whom were also experiencers, couldn't even agree on what an NDE was, let alone on a research technique or data collection instruments. The more part was that this organization that grew into IANDS was far greater than simply a research network. It did bring together researchers who could offer each other mutual advice and support that we couldn't find in our own home institutions. But it became obvious very soon that there were other, perhaps more important missions for IANDS to fulfill. One was to provide information, support, and resources to the near-death experiencers themselves. A second related mission was to provide information and resources to the experiencers' loved ones, to their healthcare practitioners, and to the general public. The founders of IANDS were a mixed group, not only in their backgrounds, but also in their reasons for interest in IANDS. Some of them, like John Odette, who at the time was a medical sociologist, and Ken Ring, a social psychologist, focused on the big picture of what was the ultimate meaning of NDEs. They looked toward how NDEs and knowledge about them and from them could transform human society, even human evolution, by promoting the spiritual growth of our species, if not our planet. As a clinical psychiatrist, my focus was much more limited, concentrating on the role that NDEs could or do play in transforming the individual experiencer. While I'm intrigued by the broader questions of the ultimate meaning of NDEs and the spiritual evolution of humanity, and what NDEs may imply about the relationship of mind, body, and spirit, I'm much more at home working with individuals, trying to integrate their own NDEs and talking them down off the cliff. So as fascinating as NDEs may be, most of my work has focused on the after effects and looking at how the experiencer's attitudes, beliefs, and values change following the NDEs, and how they and their loved ones deal with these changes. One aspect of IANDS growth over the last 30 years that surprised and gratified me has been the diversity of its members and its officers and its missions. In addition, as I said, to providing resources for researchers, which is what I was looking for, it's also grown into a worldwide support network for experiencers and an educational resource for the public through the local Friends of IANDS groups, its annual conferences like this one, the Journal of Near-Death Studies, and its sophisticated internet presence. But as surprised as I may be at some of the ways IANDS has developed over the decades, I must say in all honesty, my greatest surprise is simply that IANDS has survived 30 years. I thought it might last a few years, maybe 10. But I never dreamt that one day we'd be sitting here looking back at 30 years of conferences. I'm also surprised that after 30 years of research, any objective observer would have to say that we've barely scratched the surface of the NDE and what it means. Not only for how we understand death, but more importantly for how we understand life. The second topic that I want to focus on is how our understanding of NDEs and NDEers have evolved over the last 30 years. Before Raymond's book was published in 1975, few people ever spoke about what we now call near-death experiences. So when we first started studying NDEs in the 1970s, a lot of clinicians were quite skeptical. Many of them said they've been treating patients near death for decades, and they had never mentioned any of those things to them. They'd never heard about NDEs. The earliest studies by people like Raymond Moody, Ken Ring, and Mike Sabom presented a picture of what happens at death that was far more pleasant than most people would have expected. As a result, a lot of folks dismissed these accounts of NDEs as reassuring fantasies that people had made up to protect themselves against the terrifying prospect of death. Most of that early research was done not by interviewing patients as soon as they recovered from a near-death event, but rather with people who had survived NDEs months or years ago or even decades ago. This led some skeptics, or as Raymond accurately calls them, pseudo-skeptics, to suggest that dying really is a terrifying experience, but that over time, survivors distort their memories so that it's remembered years later as much more pleasant and peaceful than it really was at the time. Eventually, cardiologists like Mike Sabom here in the US, Sam Parnia in England, and Pim van Lommel in Holland show that if you interview patients as soon as they're resuscitated, they still report blissful experiences as soon as they can be interviewed. Nevertheless, some pseudo-skeptics still maintained that NDE accounts are embellished over time. Now, that's not a ridiculous hypothesis. We know that our memories of everyday life do become distorted over the years. And research into post-traumatic stress disorder suggests that the strong emotion that accompanies traumatic experiences can make memories of those events even more unreliable. So the question of how trustworthy NDE accounts are is an important one to answer. Because if the memory of an NDE changes dramatically over the years, then that brings into question all the research into the after effects. Now, some skeptics have argued that it's impossible to study NDEs scientifically. That raises the question of what it means for research to be scientific. There's a lot of nonsense written about what is science and what isn't science. Some researchers have insisted, for example, that you need to conduct double-blind studies to get data that is truly scientific. In so-called double-blind research, neither the researcher nor the study participants know all the details. And that can be very helpful in some limited areas of science, like when you're studying which of two drugs is more effective. But it's not appropriate, and even not possible, when you're studying a subjective feeling or an experience. It's difficult to keep research participants blind as to whether or not they've had an NDE. So how can we know whether memories of NDEs change over time? First, we certainly can, and we have, asked experiencers how their memories have changed over time. But critics can argue that those retrospective reports can be influenced by recall bias. Second, we can compare accounts of experiencers who had their NDEs fairly recently with those who had their accounts many years ago. This does get indirectly at whether NDE accounts reported soon after the event differ from those that are reported after many, many years. But critics can still argue that what we're measuring here is really a cohort effect. That is, that people who had NDEs many, many years ago, back in the 70s, are very different from people who had them in the 21st century. There are lots of ways that people and society are different now than they were decades ago. Certainly the public knows a lot more about NDEs now than it did in the 1970s. And that could influence what experiencers tell us, and in fact, what they experience. Finally, we can compare accounts. We can ask experiencers for their accounts as soon as it happened, and then again many years later, and compare their answers at those two times and see whether they change. Now, because I started collecting these accounts from people more than 30 years ago and recorded their accounts back then in real time, I can now go back to those same people and ask them to describe their NDEs again in real time. And this will presumably rule out any bias in recall. I not only collected narrative accounts 30 years ago, but I also asked experiencers to complete my NDE scale, which gives a numerical estimate for the depth of an experience. The NDE scale measures 4 different parts of the experience. The cognitive component includes changes in thinking, like your thoughts becoming clearer, the sense of time dissolving, and having a life review. The affective component includes changes in your emotional state, like feelings of peace and joy, feeling one with everything, and being encompassed by a loving being of light. The paranormal component includes things like leaving your physical body, becoming aware of things happening at a distance, and seeing visions of the future. And the transcendental component includes things like visiting an unearthly realm or dimension, meeting deceased spirits or a mystical being, and coming to a border or point of no return. Now, when I tried to contact my original group of near-death experiencers, after a lapse of 20 or more years, I found that many of them had passed on in the interim. And unfortunately, I found that those folks who passed on generally can't be bothered filling out questionnaires for me. But I did manage to track down 72 experiencers who had originally given me their accounts more than 20 years ago. Now, a pseudo-skeptic could argue that some of those had been reviewing their NDE scale scores daily for the past 20 years to make sure they wouldn't change their accounts. But when I recontacted them, I didn't tell them that I was giving them the same scale I gave them 20 years ago. And not a single one expressed any awareness that they had seen this scale before. So what did I find? The average score on the NDE scale was initially 14.6 out of a total possible of 32. After 20 years, it was 14.3, which is statistically the same. If you look at the four components individually, I'm not sure if you can see the labels, but starting on where I am, they're the cognitive, affective, paranormal, and transcendental. All four of them were statistically the same after 20 years. Particularly relevant to the skeptic's hypothesis, the NDEs had not become more pleasant over time, nor were they embellished in any way. I also looked at the exact number of years that had passed. Some were 20 years, some were 18, some were 22, and the amount of time that had elapsed was not associated with any distortion in the two accounts. So how long after the NDE you ask someone has no bearing on what they tell you. The importance of this finding is that NDE accounts appear to be trustworthy in that they're not embellished as the experience fades into the past. This means that accounts of NDEs that we get from experiencers long after the event are every bit as reliable as accounts we get as soon as they're resuscitated. Unlike memories of other emotional and traumatic experiences, memories of NDEs are stable and don't change over time. Now, the theme of this conference is after effects. So let me turn to how NDE after effects may change over time. There's an excellent chapter by Russ Noyes, Peter Finnick, Jan Holden, and Roseanne Christian in the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences that summarizes the past 30 years of research into after effects. If any of you have not read this book, this is the book you must read. It is not the NDE book with the most heart. There are others. But this is the one with the most reliable information on it. I'm not going to improve on the summary that these folks wrote in this book, but I want to highlight some of their findings for you. They found that the most consistently reported findings in 30 years of research included things like loss of fear of death, strengthened belief in life after death, feeling specially favored by God, a new sense of purpose or mission, and a heightened self-esteem. In terms of relationship with other people, they reported increased compassion and love, lessened concern for mere material gain, recognition, or status, greater desire to serve others, and increased ability to express feelings, particularly love. They had a greater appreciation and zest for life, increased focus on the present, deeper religious faith, or more often heightened spirituality, a search for knowledge, and a greater appreciation for nature. They also reported heightened sensations of all types: vision, hearing, taste, touch, smell, various physiological alterations, and unusual movements and sensations. These are actually very much like what the Kundalini researchers report happens spontaneously with Kundalini awakening. They also report unusual stimulation of particularly vision, seeing things, hearing things, and various mental, emotional changes, and increased energy and decreased need for sleep. And finally, they reported after the NDE ongoing out-of-body experiences, apparitions or visions, extrasensory perception, precognition, healing, and a variety of spiritual experiences. This is a cursory recap of the major findings of a great many studies by diverse researchers that have accumulated and reinforced one another over the past 3 decades. I need to note first that these after effects were in fact a major focus of some of the early researchers. And there are in fact very few findings that have come up over the last 30 years that were not at least hinted at by these early researchers. There were dozens of people who contributed to that knowledge, and I can't name them all. And I certainly don't mean to minimize the important contribution of each of those researchers, some of whom are in this audience. But a discussion of the major writers on NDE after effects must note that most of the after effects we talk about today were described by 3 people more than a quarter century ago. I'm referring to Russ Noyes, a psychiatrist at the University of Iowa, Ken Ring, a psychologist at the University of Connecticut, and PMH Atwater, who defies any labels. That's better than some of the other things I thought about. A lot of the research of the past 30 years has been to clarify, corroborate, and refine what these people wrote. Now, much of what they described is based on just what the NDEers told them, which in some cases proved to be quite accurate, but in other cases proved to be somewhat misleading. For example, when these pioneering researchers heard NDEers say that their IQs had increased, or they had become more psychic, or more altruistic after their NDEs, these researchers didn't actually measure their IQs, or measure their psychic abilities, or measure their altruism. They were just collecting the reports of what they had, and sometimes the reports of significant others about how these people changed. Subsequent research has added to these NDEers' verbal reports by interviewing, again, significant others who knew them before and after the NDE, and then in some cases by actually measuring the after effects. And this subsequent research has borne out most of what these early researchers reported, but not all of it. Now, before I get to the data on how these effects held up over time, I want to come back to the question of whether it's possible to obtain scientific evidence about these things. And that comes back to the question of what it means to be scientific. What makes research scientific is quite simply coming up with an idea that you want to study, and then collecting data that bears on that question in a standard and organized and rigorous and, as much as possible, controlled manner. Now, Raymond mentioned yesterday in his talk that the question of the afterlife is not a logical question. Now, that's a real problem for philosophers like Plato and Hume and Raymond. But it's not a problem for physicists like Heisenberg and Schrödinger and Bohr. For true scientists, the ultimate authority is experience, not theory. Quantum physicists deal all the time with logical impossibilities of things being simultaneously in 2 states that Aristotelian logic would say are logically incompatible. There's the famous example of Schrödinger's cat in a box, and will either be killed or not killed based on the random decay of a radioactive particle. And the question is, before you open the box and look in, what is the cat? Is the cat alive or dead? As soon as you open the box and make an observation, you know if the cat's dead or alive. What happens before you open the box? And quantum physicists would say the cat is both alive and dead before you look. Now that's clearly a logical impossibility. But thousands of quantum physical experiments rather, have shown that this is the way reality is. That in fact things not only can be, but are in two logically incompatible states until an observer looks at it. And the process of looking at it collapses the wave function and makes only one of those possible. Before that, the two logical impossibilities are coexisting. Now, some pseudo-skeptics have also insisted that science is applicable only to the material world, that scientists can study only things that can be seen or heard or felt. But in reality, scientists study non-material things all the time. There's a lot of psychological scientific research on emotions, for example. Are love and fear material? There's certainly been a lot of scientific research about these things. We can't see emotions, but we can certainly measure their after effects. And from their effects, we can learn scientifically a lot about them. Even physicists, the ultimate physical scientists, study things that can't be seen or measured directly, again by looking at their effects. Anybody know what this is? This is a photograph of a bubble chamber. Physicists produce many subatomic particles that are much too small to be seen and last for much too short a time to be seen, for fractions of a second. You cannot see them, you cannot measure them. But what you can do is when you create them, shoot them through a liquid, and as they pass through, they will leave a trail of bubbles. And by looking at the bubbles and seeing their behavior by that, you can learn about the particle. So scientists can study things that can't be measured by measuring their after effects. And they do it all the time. So it is consistent with standard practice in modern physics to study things that can't be seen or heard or felt. How do we do that with NDEs in a rigorous and controlled manner? How do we collect data on NDE after effects? We do have ample evidence, as the chapter from the handbook says, that NDEs are followed by a wide range of after effects. A separate question is how long-lasting those after effects are. How do we know how NDE after effects hold up over time? Just as with the question of how the accounts hold up over time, there are different ways of approaching the durability of the after effects. We certainly can and have asked experiencers how their attitudes and beliefs and values changed over time in the decades since their NDE. But again, critics argue that that can be influenced by recall biases. We can also compare the after effects of people who had their NDEs fairly recently and those who had them decades ago. And again, it directly gets at the difference between recent NDEs and long-standing NDEs. But again, it can be a cohort effect. The people who had the NDEs long ago are different from people who have them today. So finally, we can ask NDEers about their after effects shortly after the NDE, and then come back 20 or 30 years later and ask them the same questions again. And of course, I did that. As I did for my NDE scale, I asked near-death experiencers to complete Ken Ring's life changes inventory back in the early 1980s. And then I recontacted them in the last few years and asked them to complete the same scale again. And as with the NDE scale, the reports of the after effects remained remarkably unchanged over a 20-year period. I know that the labels are hard to see on this, but this shows the average scores of NDEers on Ken Ring's life changes inventory 20 years ago in blue and now in red. Starting on my end, By the way, these graphs, there's a 0 point, which is no change at all, and the top is greater positive change, and down below is greater negative change. So starting from my end, these are attitudes toward death, which had the greatest change, attitudes toward life, towards spirituality, towards meaning in life, attitudes towards other people, attitudes toward yourself, and then the lower ones with attitudes towards social justice, towards religion, and towards worldly concerns. Now, these are all statistically the same as they were now, the same as they were 20 years ago, except for social justice, which has increased somewhat over time. I don't know whether we're just getting older. And I should also mention that in Jan and Tracy's work with the veterans, this social justice group was not a reliable subscale. It's a small group, only 3 questions on it, and they are easy to misinterpret. They ask about things like political activism, for example, which may or might not be correlated with various attitudes. The other thing that changed is attitude towards religion, and this is much less positive now than it was 20 years ago. And again, this is asking about organized religion. It doesn't ask about spirituality, which stayed quite high. So basically, this scale suggests that for the vast majority of the after effects, they are stable over a decade-long period of time, 2 decades-long period of time. They do not diminish as the experiencer fades into the past, as the experience fades into the past. Now, one particular after effect that was not mentioned in the review in the handbook was the increased awareness of synchronicity or meaningful coincidences. There have been many anecdotal accounts of profoundly meaningful coincidences in the lives of experiencers. People like Ken Ring, PMH Atwater, Barbara Harris Whitfield, Don Morse, and Pin Van Lommel have all written that synchronicities are very common in near-death experiencers. But until recently, there hasn't been a good way to measure these meaningful coincidences. As a step towards understanding this scientifically, Bernard Beitman and his colleagues at the University of Missouri developed what they call the Weird Coincidence Scale. And this was developed to quantify and categorize categories of self-reported weird coincidences. And it includes things from knowing who's on the phone when the phone rings to finding exactly the right amount of money you need for something, to having your heart hurt when your father's having a heart attack 6 hours away. So I recently gave a sample of 200 near-death experiencers this weird coincidence scale to complete. And I asked them to respond to each item on the scale twice. Once with regard to the period in their life before the NDE, and again with regard to the period of their life since the NDE. Now again, these labels are hard to find. The bar on the left is the rate of synchronicities among the normal population. The bar in the middle are the frequencies reported by the NDEers before their NDE, which is slightly less than the general population. The bar on the right is what the NDEers said was the frequency of coincidences after the NDE, significantly higher than both before the NDE and the normal population. So after the NDE, people really do report far more meaningful coincidences than before the NDE. Furthermore, those who reported deeper NDEs, that is with higher scores on the NDE scale, reported the greatest increases in their coincidences. And likewise, those who had come closer to death physically during the NDE reported more coincidences after the NDE. So these findings put numbers to the anecdotal and subjective reports of increased synchronicities among NDEers that people have reported previously. In addition, it provides some evidence that the increased awareness of synchronicities is only apparent after the NDE, but not before, and that suggests that a prior tendency to look for meaning in life doesn't predispose you to have an NDE, but the NDE makes you much more aware of meaning in life. Now, the pseudo-skeptics were not surprised by these findings at all. The way they see it, the tendency to see meaningful patterns in these random events is just an error in logic. And what the NDE does is make you illogical. It's associated with, they say, a right hemisphere processing bias. And the way they interpret these findings is that NDEs make people more gullible and makes them view the world less logically. It is true that after an NDE, people tend to view the world more holistically and in less rigid linear terms, which is more of a right brain way of processing things. But saying that the NDEers process the world with their right hemisphere more than their left doesn't necessarily say they're illogical. The question is whether a right hemisphere bias makes you overestimate the true instance of synchronicities, or whether a left hemisphere bias makes you underestimate the true instance. Now, although people after an NDE do see the world in less rigid categories, how do we know if that makes them more or less logical? To test that notion, I also had a large number of NDEers complete a questionnaire about their preferences for logical thought, again, before the NDE and after the NDE. Though I didn't know what the outcome might be and feared that, well, that they might be less logical, my suspicion was there would be no change. That in fact, this is a stable personality trait and it's not going to change with an experience. But the results were actually very interesting. The bar on the left is the preference for logical thought before the NDE, and the preference on the right is the preference for logical thought after the NDE. To my surprise, NDEers are much more inclined to apply logic to the world after the NDE, despite seeing it more holistically. This was a little puzzling to me. When I explained this to Yolaine Stout, who was the past president of IANDS and now the president of ASSIST, she wasn't surprised at all. She said, I have to chuckle at the skeptical notion that believing in synchronicities is a sign of illogical thinking. To me, if you've experienced firsthand the reality of a spiritual dimension that lets you know you are being supported, guided, and cared for in this life, then denying there are meaningful coincidences is illogical. In fact, when I think more about it, it may be that it's being confronted with these anomalous and puzzling experiences that shake up how you see the world, that drives you to try to be more logical in making sense of it. Another after effect that wasn't mentioned in the handbook chapter, but has been reported by a number of researchers, is the experience's effects on various electromagnetic devices. And in fact, Judith mentioned yesterday in the experiences panel that she can't wear a watch after her NDE. In the mid-1990s, Jim Nitweiss actually did a small pilot study to measure the electromagnetic field around the hands of NDEers. And he obtained some very suggestive but very preliminary results that need to be followed up. Most of the common after effects that we hear about in this electromagnetic area include things like wristwatches stopping or malfunctioning, light bulbs burning out, or most characteristically, street lights going out as you drive down the street. Batteries draining from flashlight batteries to car batteries. TVs and radio stations changing as you walk by. And cell phones and computers crashing. Now, some of these happen to everybody, not just NDEers. Who has a cell phone that works well? And computers crash all the time, no matter what you do to them. And we don't know what the incidence of these effects are in the general population. But NDEers also report affecting a wide range of devices, including toasters, elevators, cash registers, defibrillators, ATMs, styrofoam cups. Some of these devices on this list were not affected by the NDEers, but were anomalously not affected. For example, one experiencer reported that when she approaches an automatic door, it will not sensor and open the way it will for everyone else. Two experiencers mentioned anomalous effects with people who have seizures. One reported that when he stood close to someone with epilepsy, that person would get a seizure. Another reported that he got a pounding headache when someone near him was about to have a seizure. And as PMH Atwater noted after our recent earthquake, severe weather phenomena often have electromagnetic components that might affect sensitive people. I'm involved now in a study with an electrical engineer and material scientist, Glenn Fox, who's an expert on integrated ferroelectrics, and with Steve Alsam and Mitch Leister to collect data on the experiencer's electromagnetic after effects. Mitch is here at the conference, and he's brought with him some of the surveys that we invite experiencers to complete. And he also has a poster which is outside in the hall here at the top of the stairs, and he'll be out there explaining that at the 5:30 session. I would encourage you to read this poster and talk with Mitch or me about this study. This survey, which will help determine the extent of this effects among NDEers, is the first phase of a three-part project. In the first phase, we hope to answer a number of related questions, not just the incidence, but also correlations. For example, are these electromagnetic effects associated with having been electrocuted or defibrillated during your NDE? Or are they associated with other types of after effects, like healing? The second phase of the study may involve asking NDEers to wear different types of watches and measure what happens to them. And in the third phase, we may want to actually measure the electromagnetic field generated by the experiencers. So we want you to fill out questionnaires whether or not you have had any of these effects. We want to tease out what types of NDEs are associated with these effects. And if the only people who fill them out are people who have them, we're not going to be able to answer that question. So we want questionnaires from the experiencers who have lots of these effects and from those who have very few or none of them. Don't be afraid to take the last questionnaire. Mitch has lots more in his room. The third topic, oh, this is his poster. So if you see it out there, you'll know what it looks like. The third topic I want to look back on is how our understanding of the mind-brain relationship has evolved as a result of what we learned about NDEs. What do NDEs mean for our understanding of consciousness? It seems to me that a lot of the data from NDEs points to something, you can call it mind, soul, spirit, something very important about human beings, something responsible for our thoughts, our feelings, our sensations, our intentions, our decisions, that's independent of our physical brains. Now, this idea that the mind and brain are separate is the way most people believed things were until a couple of centuries ago. But in the 19th century, starting with the Darwinians and the physiological psychologists, we started exploring the idea that the physical brain might be the source of all our thoughts and emotions, all our mental life. For the past century, psychologists have been moving toward the hardcore materialism that characterized 19th century physics, a physics based on classical Newtonian mechanics. They've been attempting to show that the mind is nothing more than the working of the physical brain. This materialist psychology was succinctly captured by the behaviorist John Watson, who said psychology, as the behaviorist views it, is a purely objective, experimental branch of natural science, which needs consciousness as little as do the sciences of chemistry and physics. Psychology without consciousness. It's ironic that while Watson was aligning behavioral psychology with classical Newtonian mechanics, physicists, faced with compelling experimental evidence, were moving away from this model to a view of the universe of a quantum physics that can't be formulated without reference to consciousness playing an independent role in all physical events. As Yale molecular biologist Harold Marowitz put it, it's as if the two disciplines, psychology and physics, were on fast-moving trains going in opposite directions and not noticing what's happening across the tracks. But if you choose to ignore the role of consciousness in the world, or even in our own lives, as Watson suggested psychologists should do, then a materialistic model of the world can look pretty good. As astrophysicist Paul Merrill put it, if you eliminate data that don't agree, the remaining data agree pretty well. So what are these data from NDEs that don't agree with the materialistic conception that mind is produced by the brain? NDE is an example, but only one example, of the continued functioning of the mind when the brain appears to be inactive or impaired. But some of the best evidence of mind functioning independently of brain comes from these NDEs, where there's mental clarity, vivid sensory imagery, a clear memory of the experience, and an experience more real than ordinary consciousness, even when it occurs under conditions of drastically altered brain function, in which the materialistic model would say consciousness is not possible. Now, as Raymond pointed out yesterday in talking about shared death experiences, it's certainly possible to have NDE-like experiences while you are perfectly healthy, while your brain is functioning normally. Yet a great many NDEs do occur in conditions like cardiac arrest or deep anesthesia or both, when the brain clearly is not able to function, not able to form memories, not able to perceive, not able to make thoughts. There are at least 4 features of NDEs that are particularly suggestive that the mind is not produced from the brain. These are the clear thinking, perception, and memory formulation while the brain is incapacitated, the accurate perceptions from a vantage point outside the physical body, encounters with persons who convey accurate information when no one else could have known, and encounters with deceased people who were not known at the time to have died, or who were not known by the NDE at all. Perhaps the most important of these features, because it is by far the most common, is the first, the enhanced mental functioning during the time when the brain is not functioning. Among several hundred NDEers in my studies, 80% call their thinking clearer than usual, or at least as clear as usual. 74% said their thinking was faster than usual in the NDE, or at least as fast as usual. 65% said it was as logical as usual or more. And 55% said that they had more control, or at least as much control, over their thoughts. Furthermore, if you look at the medical records of these folks, you can see that the mental functioning is significantly better in people who are physiologically closer to death. In addition, many experiences report a panoramic life review, not just brief images that you can get with brain stimulation, but huge, long scenarios, sometimes encompassing their whole lives when their brains are not functioning. Another important feature that challenges the materialistic model of mind and brain is being out of the body and accurately perceiving things that can't be perceived normally. Among several hundred NDEers in my study, 48% reported accurate out-of-body perceptions. In 1982, cardiologist Mike Sabom published his study in which he asked NDEers who had reported out-of-body experiences during their NDEs, during cardiopulmonary resuscitation, to describe in detail what they saw out of their bodies. He also asked a matched group of seasoned cardiac patients to imagine that they were out of their bodies watching the resuscitation, and asked them to try to describe it from a third-person perspective. In the matched group that didn't have NDEs, 80% made major errors in the descriptions. None of the NDEers did. And 19% of the NDEers gave very specific and unusual details that couldn't have been predicted about the resuscitation. A few years ago, intensive care nurse Penny Sartori published a 5-year study that essentially replicated Sabom's findings. All the NDEers who claimed to have left their bodies described accurate resuscitation details, whereas all the cardiac arrest survivors who didn't have NDEs gave incorrect descriptions of the procedures and the equipment. Ken Ring and Sharon Cooper reported a study of 31 blind NDEers, many of them blind from birth, who were able to describe from an out-of-body perspective the scene around them while they were having their NDEs. And in some cases, they actually gave accurate descriptions of the colors of things when they were out of their bodies. In a review of 93 published reports of verifiable out-of-body perceptions during NDEs, Jan Holden found that 92% were completely accurate. 6% had some error, and only 1% was completely wrong. Even in cases where the out-of-body perceptions were reported to an independent witness before they were corroborated, the numbers were very nearly the same, around 90% totally accurate. Now, skeptics still complain that as robust as all these stories are, they're just stories, they're just anecdotes. What we need, they say, are controlled studies of out-of-body perception. That would be nice. But it's not as easy as it sounds. I carried out a study a few years ago with patients who were undergoing a type of cardiac surgery in which their hearts had to be intentionally stopped for a short period of time. I placed a laptop computer on top of the fluoroscopy machine at the top of this slide, which is about 10 feet off the ground. When the patient's heart is about to be stopped, the computer gets turned on, it's opened up so it's facing the ceiling, and the computer randomly selects a moving, brightly colored, and easily recognized visual target to display for a short period of time and then shuts itself off. And I thank Jan's husband for programming this computer. In this way, no one in the room ever knows what the target was. The computer keeps a record of it, but no human being can see it unless they're looking down from the ceiling. So I thought this would be an ideal protocol to test the accuracy of out-of-body perception during NDEs. Unfortunately, it wasn't. Not a single patient in this procedure reported an NDE, or in fact reported any memory of the procedure. Looking back on the study design, there may have been a number of explanations for this failure. First, they were given anesthetics that interfere with memory function, because having your heart stopped is not pleasant. And maybe the anesthetic makes it harder to recall the NDE. Second, the cardiac surgeons give extensive reassurance that they're going to be monitored all the time. There's no chance something's going to happen to you. You're not going to die. So if expectation plays a role in precipitating an NDE, this might have reduced the possibility that people would have an NDE. And finally, they didn't let your heart stop very long. It was usually only a matter of a few seconds. And maybe that just wasn't long enough to rob your brain of oxygen. So sometimes what seems to be like a good idea turns out badly. I have to mention here the AWARE study, spearheaded by Sam Parnia, who was a British cardiologist and is now a critical care physician in New York. AWARE was proposed as a multinational study of NDEs in the course of cardiac arrest occurring in the hospital, so that we have lots of physiological data about what's happening to the patients and the resuscitation techniques. Like my cardiac surgery study, unlikely visual targets are placed up near the ceiling, facing up, so they can only be seen by looking down from the ceiling. So far, there's been no report of any patient in the study having an NDE, but the study has the potential to add to the evidence. Now, another line of evidence from NDEs that is problematic for the mind-brain identity model is reports of visions of deceased people. Again, among several hundred NDEs in my study, 42% report meeting recognizable deceased acquaintances in the NDEs. And these encounters are more likely to be reported the closer you come to death. The more physiologically impaired you are, the more likely you are to see deceased loved ones. In a third of these cases, the person seen was not the person you wanted to see, but instead somebody else. If these were all due to expectation and wishful thinking, it would probably not be the case. More impressively, some of these deceased people seen in the NDEs were people who were not known to be dead at the time. Let me give you an example of this. K.M. Dale, who's a pediatrician in Pittsburgh, wrote about a 9-year-old boy with meningitis who was hovering near death for about 36 hours before his fever finally broke. He was in the hospital surrounded by his anxious parents who never left his bedside. Almost as soon as he opened his eyes, around 3 in the morning, he described going to heaven, where he saw several deceased relatives. Then he added he also saw his sister Teresa, who told him he had to go back. Now the boy's father got very upset at this point because Teresa, his older daughter, was in college in Vermont at the time and perfectly healthy. So he insisted that the doctor sedate little Eddie, who was clearly delirious. And their father went home, promising his wife that he would call his daughter as soon as he got home. When he tried to telephone Teresa, he learned that the college had been trying to call him all night long to tell him that Teresa had been killed in an auto accident around midnight. Even more impressively than these cases, and there are lots of these in the literature, going back to the ancient Greeks. There's some excellent stories from some of the Greek philosophers, from Pliny, about cases like this. But even more impressively are cases where the deceased person seen was never known to the experiencer. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross published an account of a girl undergoing cardiac surgery. And during the heart surgery, she met her brother. She met someone who said he was her brother. But as far as she knows, she never had a brother. When she woke, she told her father about this. And he was so moved by her account that he acknowledged that, in fact, he and his wife did have a son who had died before this girl was born, and they never told her about him. Pim van Lommel reported the NDE of a Dutch man who during cardiac arrest saw an apparently deceased man who he didn't know, but was looking at him very lovingly. He had no idea who this person was. He asked his parents about it. They didn't acknowledge who this was. Some years later, his mother, on her deathbed, confessed to him that he was in fact born out of wedlock. And the person that he knew as his father was not his biological father. His biological father was in fact a Jewish man who had been captured by the Germans when they invaded Holland and shipped away and then died in a concentration camp. And on her deathbed, she showed her son a photograph of his biological father. And it was the man from his NDE. And tomorrow, you may hear an even more amazing account from neurosurgeon Eben Alexander about his NDE. Now, given all this information, which has really been around for centuries, how can anyone believe that the mind is produced by the brain? Well, of course, there is evidence for such a position. There's common sense evidence from our everyday lives. When you get drunk or you get a hard knock on the head, your thinking gets clouded. Scientists have more sophisticated evidence of this type. They can measure the electrical activity in your brain when you're doing different activities. And they can identify correlations between different parts of the brain and different activities. They can stimulate parts of the brain and observe what you experience and report. And they can remove parts of the brain and see what the effect is on your behavior. And all these evidence lines point to the fact that the brain is involved in the process of thinking, perception, and memory. But it doesn't necessarily suggest that the brain is causing these thoughts and perceptions and memories. As you're sitting here right now listening to me talk, there's electrical activity in your temporal lobe in Brodmann's area. Does that mean that my voice is a hallucination being produced by your temporal lobe? I don't think so. All these studies showing brain areas associated with different mental functions show correlations, not causation. They're entirely consistent with the idea that thoughts, perceptions, and memories take place in a mind somewhere separate from the brain and that are processed, received and processed by specific parts of the brain, much like a television or radio. The signal, the message is created somewhere else, but the television set or radio is necessary to receive and process the information. If scientists were to measure the electrical activity inside a TV set, or electrically excite parts of it, or remove parts of it, they could show that certain parts of the TV were involved in viewing the show. But that wouldn't prove that the TV show is produced inside the TV set, any more than the brain's produced inside your brain. The minds are produced inside your brain. Now, this materialistic idea that the brain produces the mind is a reasonably good model for our everyday life. As I said, when you get drunk, your thoughts get less clear. Likewise, classical Newtonian mechanics is a reasonably good model for our everyday lives of everyday objects moving at everyday speeds. It was only when physicists started investigating extraordinary circumstances involving objects approaching the speed of light or the behavior of microscopic wave particles that showed the limitations of the classical Newtonian model and the need for new paradigms. So too with the question of mind-brain relationships. It's only when you look at extraordinary circumstances of mental function, like what happens when you approach death, that you see the limitations of the materialistic model of mind-brain identity and the need for a different paradigm. The materialistic understanding of the world just glosses over how the electrical impulses or chemical trigger in the brain can produce a thought or feeling, or indeed anything that the mind does. Cognitive scientist Jerry Fodor summed it up like this: nobody has the slightest idea how anything material could be conscious. Nobody even knows what it would be like to have the slightest idea about how anything material could be conscious. So much for the philosophy of consciousness. In fact, those who believe the brain produces the mind have no explanation of how that can happen. And yet, despite having no idea how this could work, most neuroscientists continue to hold fast to this 19th century materialistic model that the brain, in some miraculous way that we don't have any clue about, produces the mind. And they discount or ignore all the evidence from NDEs that mind, in extreme circumstances, can function quite well without the brain. So what do we call it when someone's fixed beliefs don't accord with reality? We call it crazy. And I suggest by this criterion, when I think about the mainstream neuroscientists who still believe that mind is produced by brain, despite the empirical evidence to the contrary, I have to ask, who is it that's really crazy after all these years? Thank you.
Mike, please. We have about 7 minutes for questions, and while people are lining up, this is a reminder that you also need to put in your lunch order right at 10 o'clock. So go for it, Dan.
I just thought I'd mention, you can comment on it, but a few weeks ago, you know, they had that program on ABC about Bob Woodruff, and he was talking about it. But one of the cases where you were talking about expectations, they interviewed a woman who was an atheist, and she said when she had her near-death experience, she saw the man, and he was deceased, who had taught her atheism. So she said, well, that's who I expected, so therefore I know that it's just imagination or something like that.
Right. What do you do when you see a deceased loved one who tells you there's no such thing as life after death?
Great lecture. In your cardiac arrest study, you mentioned that nobody reported after-death experiences.
Yeah.
However, did you look at the computer? Because sometimes it seems in some of my friends it happens so fast they know something happened, but they can't say exactly what happened.
What they reported was no memory of anything during the experience. When I did this, I used a technique that actually Kim Clark Sharp taught me 20 years ago. I asked, what's the last thing you remember before you lost consciousness? And then I asked, what's the next thing you remember after that? And if they don't tell you about an NDE, if they tell you the next thing you know, I was awake with tubes in me, I say, what do you remember between those two periods? And for most of these people, when I said, what's the last thing you remember before you blacked out, they said, what do you mean, I didn't black out? They had no memory of the entire procedure. It was as if it never happened. The drugs were that good.
Thank you.
And yet, we do have NDE reports from people who have been anesthetized, who have not thought they were going to die, and who had been with a cardiac arrest for just a few seconds. So none of these things would make us think you can't have an NDE. They just didn't in this sample that I had.
Thank you. One other quick question. The NDE scale components that you were talking about, the 4 items, is that listed in a study? Because you didn't mention a study or in a book, or?
Yes. I was originally published in the 1983 paper. It's been published several times. Actually, we don't use the 4 components so much anymore. We thought that they might be correlated with different after effects or different causes, and for the most part, they haven't been. So the whole scale as a whole is very helpful, but breaking it down into parts doesn't make much of a help, doesn't add anything to that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope that IANDS puts your presentation on YouTube for the world. Be very, very meaningful. I am not an NDEer. I experienced everything you're talking about through consciousness with my son, who is in the afterlife, and out-of-body experiences. And I came to IANDS to ground myself and not feel singular, and it's been extremely healing for me. And on being normal, I have discovered that there's a mean variation, and the median is who you're keeping company with. And Albert Einstein once is quoted as saying, "The smartest man in the universe." A question that often drives me hazy is, am I, or are all the others crazy?
Yeah.
So my question for you is, in your studies, are you interested in having people like me fill out your form, or just NDEers?
I want everybody.
Pardon me?
I want everybody.
Okay.
Actually, sounds more like the thing that Raymond is studying now, looking at the shared death experiences, where you empathically experience something with someone else who is crossing over or has crossed over. So maybe you want to talk with Raymond about.
Encore.
Yeah.
You explained to me why neither my iPad nor my iPhone are working properly. And I've turned them off, and can't wait to get them away from here. With regard to the double-blind studies, I worked for many years as a chaplain in a cardiac hospital with lots and lots of brainy docs, and there were in two groups. Those who regularly were involved in resuscitations, MDs, EMTs, ER staff, etc., and they thoroughly understood NDEs and encouraged me to write about this. And then there were those who were never involved in it, and they had the greatest doubts. I found that the medical staff devolved into those two groups. And with regard to double-blind studies, I always enjoyed asking them, did you select your spouse that way? And one said, yes, my first wife. My first wife, yes. I held the ceremony for him to his second wife, and no one would describe her as beautiful, but a lovely person. He quit using Aristotelian logic. I have a friend who died several times in an ambulance on the way to the hospital. And I called on him as soon as he woke up, because they had him induced in an induced coma. And but when I was talking to him, he still had a ventilator, so he could not talk. And I asked him, because we were friends, described the NDEs to him, and did you have any of this experience? And his eyes got very big, and he nodded as best as he could. Well, I came back. I went off on a month-long trip. When I came back from it, I went right to see him and brought up the subject again. And he said, John, I have no memory from the time I was in the ambulance till the time I woke up in this rehab hospital. They've been giving him Versed, which I think must block out an awful lot of NDE memories.
Versed is what we used in the cardiac arrest study.
There you go. And I certainly hope you're going to print the report you just gave us.
Thank you. Scott's telling me we have time for one more, so Pam, you're it.
All right. My question is, I'm wondering, you didn't mention it, but are there any studies being done with the functional MRIs comparing people without NDEs and those who've had them in terms of after effects?
Actually, Mario Beauregard at Montreal has put NDEers in the fMRI and asked them to try to recall the NDE, which is not the same as measuring them while they're having it. But what he has found is very similar to what Andy Newberg finds at Penn with people who are communing with God or in deep meditation. And it's essentially that many, many parts of the brain are active when you're having this experience. It's what you expect. You're thinking, you're feeling, you're perceiving. You're having a lot of different states. So you've got temporal, parietal, and frontal lobe all involved with it.
Thank you.
Thank you.